Hello, I'm Dr Annalene Weston, Dentolegal Consultant at Dental Protection. Welcome to RiskBites, a series of podcasts created specifically for dental practitioners in Australia. RiskBites looks at key dental legal risks and issues affecting dental practitioners across Australia and provides helpful advice and guidance on how to steer clear of them, leaving you free to provide safe and high-quality dental care for your patients. So in this edition, I'm joined by my colleague and fellow dental legal consultant, Dr Colm Harney, on this curiously entitled podcast, Uber and Audits. So Colm, I think the first issue is going to be, what do ride-hailing services such as Uber have in common with audits by third-party payment entities, such as, for example, private health insurers or Medicare?
Nice to be here. I suppose the answer to that question is the next time you call an Uber and it meets you on the street within a few meters of where you're standing, have we ever thought about the astonishing technology at play when this happens?
Well, Colm, it is, of course, wonderful to have you here today. And no, I haven't ever really thought about it, but I have a funny feeling that maybe you have.
I have, and it does interest me. But what actually occurs is that a global positioning system, otherwise what we call the GPS device, taps into a constellation of satellites that orbit around the Earth about 17,000 k's above and transmit radio wave signals to receivers across the planet. Now, these satellite systems were developed by the US Department of Defense, and now used by our phones, cars, data trackers. Everything uses these GPS satellites to locate us in a process that we call trilateration, and this is where we're going to get to. So the GPS receiver receives the signal from our phone, pings up to the satellites, and actually pings to 3 different satellites, and those signals come back down and gives us our location on Earth, a very unique location, latitude, longitude, and height.
Yeah. Now, my son has explained this to me, and he's also said that there are 3 reference points that historically have been used for many purposes. And this idea of this 3 reference points, like surveying, navigation, meteorology, and also astronomy, that's correct, isn't it?
Yeah. Now, I like to climb hills and mountains as well. And if anybody does that sort of thing in countries such as Ireland, England, UK, New Zealand and Australia, you'll see these little concrete points on the top of mountains called trig points or trigonometrical stations. And they are, again, these points that were used for trilateration, for surveying and measuring the land. And they still exist. Now, nowadays, of course, to measure the height of a mountain, again, you'd use GPS or satellites. But again, that's still using that trilateration principle, that the 3 points coming back down to locate things on Earth in a specific location, latitude, longitude, height.
That's awesome. Now, thank you for explaining, first of all, what I would find on the top of a mountain, because that's not somewhere I'm ever likely to hike to. But also, I need to understand, Colm, fascinating as this is, how does this actually apply to audits?
Yes. So just like those early days of mapping and surveying, audits usually use a minimum of 3 reference points to determine whether a claim is acceptable to the payment entity. So those 3 points are, number 1, the rules of the entity, such as private health insurance fund rules and documents such as the CDBS or Child Dental Benefit Schedule. They've got rules about their fund or their entity payments. The second is the most current descriptor of item codes used for claiming, such as the Australian Schedule and Dental Services Glossary, which is published by the ADA. We know we're currently in edition 13. But also for the CDBS, they've got an appendix in their guide and schedule as well. The third is, and this applies for many things that we talk about in dental protection, but the third reference point is the Dental Board of Australia policies, codes and guidelines, and often cited in, for example, entities when they question providers, is the Shared Code of Conduct, especially 8.3, the health records.
Yeah, and overlying or underpinning all of this, perhaps, is the question or consideration of why a practitioner might be audited in the first place.
Sure. Yeah, and that's a really good question, and certainly worth considering this first before we discuss this triangulation or trilateration process and how it might be used to determine whether a claim is acceptable.
Yeah, and I think in general, I feel that there are like two broad reasons why a practitioner may become the subject of an audit. So one is chance, and the other one is by selection or targeting.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So it's usually the majority are targeted, but there are occasionally as inconvenient and as concerning as it may be for you as a provider, you may just be the subject of a random audit by a third party payment entity. So, for example, a private health insurer may decide to just randomly audit a selection of practitioners receiving fees from the fund. And I think we'd probably understand that from a due diligence process. They've got to justify or demonstrate to their stakeholders and shareholders that they carry out their checks and balances to protect the pool of fund paid into by their members.
Yeah, and we do see the random ones, but of course, more commonly is the targeted audit type, which is really where we're moving towards today, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And certainly the targeted type of audit is the more prevalent. There can be a number of triggers for a practitioner becoming subject of an audit, such as a past history of being audited, particularly if there were adverse findings for that practitioner. In our experience, practitioners who've been subject of previous findings against them certainly, as we both know, remain on the radar of that entity.
Yeah, and a lot of the health funds are quite explicit about this in their correspondence, don't you think?
Yeah.
So a previous finding by a health fund should be seen as a non-negotiable opportunity to address any deficiencies identified in the audit moving forwards.
Yeah, I think, and as you said, they are quite explicit when there is an adverse finding, they lay it out for the practitioner that you're going to be on our radar for a while. The next trigger is what we would call, I suppose, outlier billing practices. So that's billing practices that sit on one end or the other of the bell curve, on the extremes of the bell curve. And as we know, the third-party entities now have sophisticated tracking systems and analysis resources. Some of them use AI, and some of them still use old human cognitive horsepower. They've got these dentally educated investigators, and they review the data and identify any unusual patterns of behavior. Now, that's not to say that outlier billing means non-compliance, as we know. There may be many valid reasons, such as, specific uncommon treatments that you may do in your practice. For example, if you see a lot of young kids in your practice, or another example is some practitioners go into care homes and see elderly patients. So they might have a higher than average amount of glass ionomers and those sorts of things to stabilize teeth.
Yeah, we've seen this as well, haven't we, with colleagues on a MaxFax training pathway where they just work one day a week and all they do is surgical extractions.
Yeah.
And that would ping as an outlier because that's all they're doing.
Yes.
And it's a simple explanation, really, if you do get an audit. And of course, absolutely something that we can help you with.
Yeah. I think we would help you just with identifying that outlier billing practice and giving a reasonable explanation to the fund.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the next thing that may bring you to the attention of the entity is working in a practice with a previous issue where there's a history of previous issues. Now, that may draw a previously unaware practitioner into an audit just by virtue of these past issues in the practice. For example, it can be very confronting for a new associate who starts in a practice and then is within 6 months is subject of an audit and they've got no idea what's going on.
Absolutely.
And the last, what we usually see in terms of the regular reasons for being subject of an audit is a complaint to the entity. So an example of that might be a patient who's unhappy with a rebate they've received, or they're concerned about the amount of codes that have been billed. They may make a complaint to the fund, and the fund may run the ruler over the practitioner about that. Also, in terms of those complaints to the entity, we sometimes hear of disgruntled staff members who leave a practice and then make a report on what they see as questionable billing or coding behavior by the practitioner as part of a workplace dispute or grievance.
Yeah. So I think our listeners are going to want to know, Colm, once this audit is triggered for whatever reason and this correspondence then arrives, what does it usually look like?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And I think what we think may or may not happen and what actually happens are often two quite different things. Most audit processes that we see start with some form of desktop audit. So not what we would think of as being, I suppose, a reasonable way of doing it, where we think that they may be getting the patient in and reviewing our treatment. They actually start with a desktop audit. So that means that the entity contacts the practitioner and usually starts by requesting comment on a particular area of concern and maybe asking for records. So at the time of this podcast, Medicare have just run a review, and that's just closing down now of what they're looking at for CDBS, and they've been looking at 88114s. So they will just sometimes run the ruler over an item number or an area of concern, and they'll ask for a selection of records from the practitioner.
Yeah, and that's at 3 reference points, of course. Now, first off, Colm, the first question we always get asked, as you know, is we're contacted by often completely understandably quite indignant or distressed practitioners who want to know what right the Health Fund has to access a copy of this patient dental record of this patient.
Yeah. And again, as you said, it's completely understandable. We're taught about privacy concerns and patient confidentiality, and then we get this letter from a third party payment entity asking for full dental records of a patient. So the first thing we need to consider is that first point is the rules of the entity, and hopefully in any correspondence it'll be specified what rules or what rights the entity has to access the information requested. And we would advise that the relevant rules should be cited in the written request for records. As we know, records should never just be released based on a phone request due to privacy, confidentiality, and those security considerations. Of surprise, I think we know to many practitioners is even that the use of that ubiquitous high caps machine means that certain agreements are enacted, and it pays to actually go and have a fossick around and read the high caps private health insurance provider agreement. And I'll point you to Section 4 and handling transactions. It's a bit of an eye-opener.
Yeah, and I don't know if you remember this, Colm, but one of the things that we actually get new dental legal consultants to do is review documentation like this because it is unexpected. And we've all been working as clinicians for so long. And in order for you to be able to respond to these concerns, you need to have this information at your fingertips.
Yes.
And it's something that we get all the new consultants and advisors to do because it is a bit of a surprise.
Yeah, it is. It is. And the things that we knowingly or unknowingly sign up to agree or comply to. And also, continuing on that theme, each entity will have their own rules and there's individual variations within those rules. So broadly speaking, the rules of relevance regarding audits are the rights of the entity to check compliance, such as requesting records or carrying out practice visits, and the possible consequences that can arise for non-compliance with these requests.
One other factor that can be invoked from private health fund rules, of course, is claiming for family members, staff and their families, and how broad or narrowly this can extend.
Yeah. And again, each private health insurer has some interpretation of these restrictions on claiming for family staff. So it does pay to read the relevant rules, as this can be a subject of an audit. So, for example, some funds will only restrict family, immediate family and children, and other funds will restrict even staff and even indeed family of staff. So it can be quite broad, it can be quite narrow, depending on the fund.
Yeah, and if you're not clear from reading the fund rules, it's prudent just to ring the health fund up. And we're aware of practitioners who've wanted to provide a course of treatment to a family member, and the fund rules may, for example, say no family, but there have been circumstances when this has been applied for in advance with appropriate documentation that the health fund has said, no, on this occasion for this course of treatment, this is okay. And it's far better to find out in advance before you provide the treatment than have to pay all the money back.
Correct.
It's also worth practitioners who do treatment on CDBS considering whether they're compliant with the administrative side, such as their consent forms, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. That's really important as well. So considering those admin processes of entities like CDBS is something that some practitioners and practices overlook too. Yeah.
And the consequences of that last time were quite severe, of course.
Next point in that trial iteration, Annalene, is we have the descriptor of item codes used for claiming. So there's much crossover in this with the next one, the code of conduct as well. But by way of giving you, I suppose, a simple example of how the descriptor of item codes can be queried, for example, is something we see all the time. If an 022 is claimed, you and I know that the obvious thing is we can show a radiograph. However, that's not often actually what they're looking for. If you go and read the wording, and most practitioners will know this, that the wording says not just the taking of the X-ray, it's the interpretation of the imaging as well. That's really important. And you must have some way of evidencing that, or you may not be compliant.
Absolutely. And another common one that catches practitioners out relates to the claiming of a 114. So for our listeners who aren't familiar with this, if you're claiming for a 114 on, say, an 8-year-old, the argument would be that presence of that calculus was unusual enough finding that it ought to be documented somewhere in the records, because it's not standard to see calculus in every single 8-year-old that you treat. So it would be unusual enough that it would warrant some sort of documentation. And oftentimes an expectation there would be something like some oral hygiene advice to accompany it. And if that's not in the contemporaneous record, we have had occasions where a claim has been deemed non-compliant.
Yeah, and agreed. And that's something, again, referencing back to the exact wording of the descriptor. But also, I suppose there are other means after the fact at our disposal that ways that we can assist practitioners to demonstrate their compliance, such as, I suppose, showing intraoral photographs or maybe a bite wing X-rays that show calculus between molars or baby molars, which is, as you said, is quite unusual. But also things like the PSR screening may demonstrate to the satisfaction of the fund. However, when push comes to shove, the simplest way is to describe the procedure, describe your findings of calculus in your records made at the time or contemporaneously, as we say.
Absolutely, it's the safest way.
Yeah, and other things that we see as an 071, for example, should be described in terms of how it's outlined in the glossary. There should be a physical model that can be produced, and it should not be a working model. Now, this list is by no means exhaustive, and actually these are usually just the low-hanging fruit that the Health Fund will look at straight away, the 022s, the 114s, and that's what they usually get to before they get to all the weird and wonderful coding that's used.
Yeah, and it certainly pays, I think, Colm, to read the glossary and pedantically review the wording of every code that you're using, especially if you are using those more uncommon codes. Yeah. It's also important to remember that the ADA is the arbiter of the appropriate use of these codes. Mm-hmm. It's an ADA glossary. Yeah. And the glossary states that any dentist or third party requiring clarification or interpretation of the schedule and glossary should contact the ADA. Now, when you look at the glossary, if you go, I think it's on the back cover or it's inside the back cover, the email address is actually there that will direct you to the ADA Glossary Committee. And they're incredibly helpful.
They're really helpful and really knowledgeable. They know this stuff inside out. And you don't have to be an ADA member. You just have to be using the glossary and you can access that information.
Yeah, so that's how you find it for people who are interested or wanting to have a look.
Yeah. And third leg of the stool is in that trilateration is to consider the Dental Board of Australia policies, codes and guidelines. So the old mantra that we always use is say it, do it and write it down. And this applies here. So these rules, again, are not set by dental protection or even the private health funds. We sign up every November to that shared code of conduct, and part of that is Principle 8, professional behaviour. So that means we're displaying a standard of professional behaviour that warrants the trust and respect of the community. So embedded in that Principle 8 is the health records, and this can be cross-referenced in the dental records section, fact sheet, self-reflective tool, audit, all of those things you can find by looking in there. So the key guiding principle here is 8.3D, I think, and that is to ensure that the records are sufficient to facilitate continuity of care.
Yeah, we discuss this all the time, don't we, Colm? But of course, your records, it's a great way of describing it. It's sufficient to facilitate continuity of care because your records should tell a story of each patient's journey with you, and it needs to be logical, consistent with accepted practice, and adequately documented so anyone taking over that treatment can do so without difficulty and know whereabouts on the journey the patient is. And there needs to be an inherent transparency with what has been done and why.
Yeah, I agree. And as part of an audit, the third party can leverage these obligations we have to practice to a certain standard, which includes record keeping. So if it can be demonstrated that a practitioner doesn't meet that standard, and this can be identified in audit, then it may be used, regrettably, to enact consequences such as claiming fees back.
Yeah, and that's the consequence of an audit that practitioners very much want to avoid.
Yeah.
And the concept of professional behaviour can also be invoked with certain adverse regulatory or criminal matters where a private health fund may claim the practitioner has behaved in an unprofessional manner that might bring the reputation of the fund into disrepute by their continued association. Curious, hey?
Yeah, it's curious, and it is something we do see from time to time as well. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff there, that a lot of information, but in summary, when the third-party payment entities audit practitioners, they do triangulate off these three reference points mentioned: the fund rules or the entity rules, the schedule and glossary, and the Dental Board of Australia policies and guidelines. So they use these three reference points to determine where on the landscape of claiming the practitioner lies. And regrettably, when the auditing party does correlate this data from the three sources, and despite the sophistication of the tools we know they don't often have to look very hard. And at first, they will pass on these low-hanging fruit that I referenced early. So anomalies on the 022, the 114s, these 071s, claiming for family and all those things. They're the things that they look at first.
Absolutely, because it's a quick win for them if they find it.
Yeah.
And while the dental practitioner, of course, is given the right of reply, it's very deflating for all of us, including us at Dental Protection, because we really want to help, but our hands are then tied by the inarguable non-compliance against those metrics above. So I think the question then, Colm, is what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, I agree with that. So the old adage of prevention is better than cure. And fortunately, there's plenty that can be done right now by practitioners. I think the first point is just simply review the information freely available on private health insurer websites or Services Australia for the Child Dental Benefit Schedule. And if you're in any doubt, you can even call us and we can give you advice or point you in the right direction as to where this information might be. I think it's even more important if you're in any sort of preferred provider arrangement, as you will actually be held to a higher standard in terms of these rules. So, if you're in one of those arrangements, I think it's really important that you do go and have a look at those rules and regulations, high caps agreements, etc.
Yeah, and you may have more to lose if you're in a preferred provider relationship too, because not only can there be the audit, but there are occasions, of course, where funds remove your provider privileges.
Yes.
And if that's the basis of your business, that can be incredibly damaging.
It can. So, as a minimum, be aware of the existence of these rules and understand that you have knowingly or perhaps unknowingly signed up to comply by your engagement with these entities. So, as a registered practitioner interfacing with these entities, it is your responsibility ultimately at the end of the day. Have a look at the code of conduct and the record standard. Again, that will give you so much more information on so many different things. We do sign up every year again to comply when we re-register, so it never does any harm to just brush up on what the regulator expects of us. I think a good thing also that we recommend from time to time is just do a self-audit. Pick 5 to 10 sets of your records, run the ruler over them, or go to a colleague and hand them over to a colleague and you take your colleague's records. It just is a really good thing to do from time to time, not just for health fund audits, but for so many other things. But ultimately, when it comes to avoiding audits, knowledge is power. So once you have a handle on all this information and you're satisfied that your systems and protocols are compliant, I think you can just go back to relaxing, back to that analogy of catching an Uber. You just do it, oblivious to all the sophisticated systems going on in the background. And but you need to have done your research and have your understanding and your systems and protocols in place. I think you can then go back to just doing what we do and practice your dentistry.
No, absolutely. Just a little bit of hard work at the start just to know that you're safe.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Colm, and thank you all for listening. And we do hope this podcast was helpful to you, and we look forward to sharing more guidance with you in the future. If you like Dental Protection podcasts and you'd like to hear more, please subscribe and leave a review.